Okay, we'll start with this. The news broke earlier today. I'm sure you've heard it. Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford agreed to terms for potential November 19th mega fight. A strategically placed bit of information. It's no coincidence they decided to break this news the week of Canelo versus Golovkin.
Just a few days out from the fight.
Just two. Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford have agreed to all material terms for a fight for the undisputed welterweight championship, an event targeted for November 19th in Las Vegas, multiple sources told ESPN. However, the deal has not been signed as the parties' lawyers clean up legal language in the agreement. Per sources, Crawford, ESPN's #1 pound-for-pound boxer and top welterweight, acquiesced to all proposed financial terms from PBC creator Al Heyman, including the short end of a revenue split, sources say. Right now, lawyers are going through the contract,
deciphering any ambiguous language that might be in there.
The package includes a bilateral rematch clause that the loser will have the right to exercise per source. If the rematch clause is triggered, the winner will earn the majority of revenue for the return bout per sources.
So this could end up being a two-fight engagement.
Close to a year since Terrence Crawford parted ways with Top Rank, which was long believed to be an impediment to this match, at least according to Errol Spence Jr. Crawford having been on the wrong side of the street. For my money,
this guy last fought under the Top Rank banner in October of last year. This fight shouldn't have taken this long to make.
Though I am likely beating a dead horse when I say that, this fight, at least for me, it's long overdue. The 147-pound summit meeting, Spence holds the WBC, WBA, and IBF titles, while Crawford has the WBO belt. Will be represented as a co-promotion between Spence's Man Down Promotions and Crawford's TBC Promotions on PBC pay-per-view. High-powered attorney Jeffrey Spitz is representing the Al Heyman Spence side as the contracts are being reviewed. I want Terrence Crawford. That's the fight that I want. Spence's ESPN #2 welterweight and #3 pound-for-pound boxer said in April, that's the fight that everybody else wants. Terrence, I'm coming for that belt.
Yeah, well, it took you long enough.
Let's not forget that Errol Spence Jr. has two hungry, young, unbeaten up-and-comers. Two hungry, young, unbeaten contenders waiting for him. And if they didn't make this fight, he'd have to deal with one of them.
Imminent Stanionis by way of the WBA, Jaron Boots by way of the IBF.
They had to get Imminent Stanionis to step aside, convince him just to allow for the Spence versus Ugas fight to take place. Back when Ugas had the WBA title, Imminent Stanionis was his mandatory challenger, and they had to get him to stand down. It appears that they have once again
convinced him to step aside, and I'm not complaining.
I'm just saying, that's how we got here. Now everybody's saying that Errol's back and he's 100% ready, so now is the perfect time for me and him to fight. Crawford, 34, told ESPN in April, he called me out, so it ain't no backing up.
Crawford has proven how much he wants this fight, because you saw what Mike Kopinger said. He acquiesced.
He acquiesced to getting the shorter end of the split in order to make this fight happen. In truth, neither one of these two guys had all that many options outside of fighting each other in terms of a big fight, a mega fight. They really didn't. If Errol didn't fight Bud, he'd have to fight one of his mandatories, a risky proposition. And Bud,
outside of this fight, what the hell were his options?
They needed each other. They really did. I'm free to do whatever I want, said Crawford, a 3-division champion from Omaha, Nebraska. There's nothing standing in the way from us fighting. There's no promotional company that's blocking it. There's no wrong side of the street. There's no nothing. Let's see who the best welterweight in the world is.
The only reason I think we're getting this fight is because Errol was painted into a corner.
Periodically throughout the year, I reminded you guys that there were 1 or 2 unbeaten up-and-comers that were in hot pursuit of Errol Spence Jr.'s alphabet titles, and how Initially, it may not have been their plan to put Errol in there with Terrence, but they had to alter their original plan
Based on the current situation, you've got unbeaten Jaron Boots Ennis by way of the IBF, unbeaten imminent Stanionis by way of the WBA.
The only way you can get around your mandatories is to schedule a unification match. In this instance, the undisputed title fight between Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. Because if you're not unifying, you're going to have to fight one of them.
But if you are unifying, you can petition for an exemption to the mandatory, at which point the alphabet organizations will adjudicate and allow you that.
Allow you that courtesy, that privilege, that wiggle room to go into another fight while your mandatory challenger waits. And those two mandatories, imminent Stanionis, Jaron Boots Ennis, these guys aren't known.
It's not just that they're high-risk, low-reward guys, it's also that they ain't box office.
They're not. You have to consider the numbers from the Ugas versus Pacquiao fight and how those numbers weren't nothing to write home about, not even with the name of Manny Pacquiao attached to the bill. You have to look at those numbers from the Ugas versus Spence fight. Those numbers, they weren't nothing to write home about either. And that was with Ugas, who had just beaten Hall of Famer Manny Pacquiao.
Think about that.
These guys, imminent Stanionis and Jaron Boots Ennis, they're not even as well known as Ugas.
So what would Spence versus Stanionis have done at the box office? What would Spence versus Ennis have done at the box office?
Do you see what I mean? You got two guys, they're very hungry guys, unbeaten guys, want to make names for themselves, and you're not even going to make a lot of money putting Spence in there with those guys. So for running risks with them, you might as well do the Crawford fight. Yeah, Errol might lose that fight.
Yeah, you might, but you might get more bang for your buck doing that fight than doing those fights, because don't nobody know those guys.
This fight is more of a box office fight than either one of those two fights, so it's only right. I don't think it was their original plan to do this thing. I didn't forget that initially at the start of this year, Tim Smith, the PBC's VP of Communications, said in so many words, he didn't think people would buy this fight. He felt that people would just steal it.
You tell me what kind of message that sends.
I feel like they eventually just buckled to the pressure of having to put on a big fight this year, because they still haven't. They have to compete with platforms like DAZN that have put on several big fights throughout the course of the year. This weekend's fight, Canelo versus Golovkin 3. 1 or 2 weeks ago, Joshua versus Usyk, the Katie Taylor versus Amanda Serrano showdown, Top Rank and ESPN, they're doing their fights. The PBC's got to keep up. They have to try and compete.
And this was one of the only big fights they could really put on.
And if they finalize this fight this week, they will have approximately 8 or 9 weeks to really push this thing and really promote it, as the tentative fight date is November 19. That's really not that far away when you think about it.
I guess it helps that people have been waiting for this fight for a little over 4 years.
It's been built up over 4 years, if you want to call it build up, a series of substitutes and alternatives to a Crawford fight, while Crawford scrounged around looking for somebody willing.
Top Rank did the best they could in that situation, but Terrence Crawford was being frozen out. That's the truth.
Perhaps I'm not as excited as some others, or as excited as I should be. I was kind of over it, being honest with you. If this fight didn't take place, if it didn't happen, I was okay with it. I moved on.
Yeah, I really wasn't invested anymore.
The careers of both of these guys were not careers that were generating all that much excitement, generating excitement overall, and I wasn't all that excited about them anymore. I moved on. There were other fights and other things going on in the sport to where it's not a life or death situation if these two guys don't fight. So while this is welcome news, the best parallel I can give you, it's like, you
go out,
you save your appetite to go to some great restaurant, you get there and the food just takes a really long time and you're really hungry, but you wait because it's supposed to be worth it.
And you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting.
You just keep waiting and you get irritated.
After a while, you're pissed off, you're ready to leave.
The fucking food finally arrives, but by the time it does, you're so fucking pissed off, you're not really enjoying it.
I don't have a lot to add to this conversation. I mean, I haven't changed my original stance. I still think Crawford's going to win this thing.
I've talked about the fight and broken it down so many times over the last 4 years. I can't be bothered to do that again. I'll leave the link in the description box to some of the videos where I talked about the fight and how I think it's going to look, how I think it's going to play out, why I'm going with Terence Crawford to win this thing. I think the only thing that's working against Terence is by the night of the fight, it will have been a year's time since Terence Crawford last saw action. He was last in action in October of last year. This fight is taking place in November of this year. And I really don't like seeing fighters inactive for long periods of time, a year's time. The saving grace for Crawford, however, is that he's a consummate professional. He does really take care of himself between fights, and you can see that by way of his social media.
Yeah, the guy's a gym rat. He's really strong, too. Stronger than he looks.
Stronger than Spence's fans think.
Fallout from the fight, the repercussions. What happens if Terence wins?
Well, Terence Crawford is currently ranked as the number 2 pound-for-pound fighter on the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list. That could change this weekend if Canelo Alvarez successfully defends all of his alphabet titles in the super middleweight division.
Usyk is ranked at number 1, Terence is ranked at number 2.
Canelo Alvarez, who is not seen here, was ejected from the list after having dropped a decision to Dimitri Bivol. But Canelo Alvarez, as we all know, has a very credible argument. He's beaten more active reigning world champions than both Alexander Usyk and Terence Crawford. Been a champion at more weights than Alexander Usyk and Terence Crawford. And in that way, all he really has to do is get himself back in the winner's bracket.
Did you guys forget that he's still an undisputed champion?
If he successfully defends all of those alphabet titles he still holds in the super middleweight division, not only is he going to be reintegrated into this list,
he'll be number 1. He's got both Usyk and Crawford beat out.
He's won more titles overall than they have, beaten more champions than they have, at more weights than they have. And if he successfully defends his undisputed crown in the super middleweight division, he's back on the list, which will bump Usyk down to number 2 and Terence down to number 3.
Devin Haney might end up falling off the list altogether. He's at number 10.
So you have the outcome of this weekend's fight to consider, and then you must consider what might happen on November 19th. If Terence Crawford emerges the victor, he will have a credible enough argument to move past Alexander Usyk
and occupy the number 2 spot, as he will be a 2-time undisputed champion and a 3-division champion overall.
When you think about how that breaks down, if Terence were to win in November, that would make him a 3-time lineal, 3-time Ring Magazine, 3-division, 2-time undisputed champion.
He'd be a shoo-in for a number 2 spot, arguably number 1 depending on what's going on at the time.
Now, if it were to happen the other way, if Errol were to win the fight in November, well, Errol is currently ranked in the number 7 spot, bottom tier of the list. If he were to beat Terence Crawford, he would move past Josh Taylor. He would move past,
well, depending on how he wins, he might also move past Jermell Charlo, who currently reigns as his division's undisputed champion.
Style points would definitely come into it, but he would move up. He would move up a few spots, 1 or 2. But because he hasn't been a champion at as many weights as Terence, has never held the Ring Magazine title, never been a lineal champion, he doesn't have the same argument that Terence has. This ain't Terence's first rodeo.
But for Errol, this would be the first time he fights to become an undisputed champion. Terence has been there and done that.
Looks like there's going to be a lot of movement on the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list in the fall months. And just in keeping with the theme of news out of the welterweight division, up-and-comer Virgil Ortiz petitions the WBA to have mandatory status enforced against Amantis Stanionis. There was a point when Virgil Ortiz was willing to remain active whilst waiting for a title shot or at least a big fight. The unbeaten welterweight contender now aims for those worlds to collide. A petition has been filed with the WBA by Ortiz, who seeks to have his mandatory challenger title status enforced in a showdown with secondary WBA welterweight titleist Amantis Stanionis. Both boxers are stuck in a holding pattern awaiting a shot at the division's top prize as WBA Super, WBC, IBF champion Errol Spence Jr. and WBO titleist Terence Bud Crawford continue to negotiate a targeted undisputed championship, which is what we just talked about. One thing we have done, since I'm the WBA mandatory or whatever, we reached out to the WBA and pushed the mandatory thing to fight Stanionis, Ortiz revealed during a recent interview with the Zone Boxing Show co-hosts Akin Ak Reyes and Barack Bess. Hopefully, we get it by the end of this year.
You know the way that breaks down. Imminent Stanionis is Spence's mandatory.
And Virgil Ortiz is imminent Stanionis is mandatory. Virgil Ortiz, who is ranked at number 1 by way of the WBA's rank standings.
Would be a bit of a raw deal for imminent Stanionis to not only have stepped aside twice to allow Errol to unify,
Because he's essentially given up his title shot 2 times if this Crawford versus Spence fight comes off. But not only that, he would be so confronted with a high-risk, low-reward guy in Virgil Ortiz if the WBA...
If they decide to order this fight, I have to admit I very much like the idea of Ortiz versus Stanionis, but for Stanionis,
he'd be getting a bit of a raw deal. You have to think about it. He already stepped aside to allow Yordenis Ugas to fight Errol Spence Jr., and he ended up stuck with
Radzav Butaev. Not an easy out. Very tough guy. Throws a lot of punches.
He's a bit of a switch hitter, too. Fights orthodox, fights southpaw. Imminent Stanionis won a hard-fought decision against Radzav Butaev, and now you're talking about sticking him in there with Virgil Ortiz.
I'm not complaining. I'm just saying, this guy, he ain't got it easy.
He wouldn't opposite the ring Virgil Ortiz, who wants his chance at a title. He wants the biggest fight there is to get him one step closer to Spence or Crawford. Rick Merrigan, Ortiz's manager, told BoxingScene.com, at 147, he has the best resume of anyone coming to challenge the throne. He knows the value of that prestigious WBA title, and he wants his chance. We hope Golden Boy Promotions, Ortiz's career-long promoter, and the WBA can make it happen. Virgil stands ready for whatever can be worked out between them. What a fight to end the year with, if it gets done. And he's right. That would be one hell of an entertaining fight because they're both punchers.
Imminent Stanionis has been seen on PBC shows. He was last in action on the undercard of Spence versus Ugas.
But I'm not sure that he himself is an according to Hoyle PBC fighter. Last I checked, he's a pro bellum fighter. So going over to the Golden Boy promotion side of things for such a fight really shouldn't be an issue.
The thing is, if the WBA orders it, Stanionis isn't going to have much of a choice. Not if he wants to hold his position in their rank standings.
Not if he wants to hang on to that secondary title so he can stay in position to either challenge the winner of Spence versus Crawford or fight for the vacant title once it becomes vacant.
Stuck between a rock and a hard place. Lucky for that kid, he's got a hard face.
Gives one too. I have to admit that while it might not be the best thing for imminent Stanionis, I very much like the idea of this fight.
Let's see if the WBA doesn't make it happen.